It was late in the evening when the man left his office, tired but relieved that another long day was finally over. The city lights shimmered in the distance as he got into his black SUV parked near the entrance. He wasn't just any man. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of the most respected figures in the country. But tonight he didn't look the part. He had taken off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and rolled up his sleeves. To anyone passing by, he seemed like an ordinary man heading home after work. The director had spent the entire day in meetings, dealing with everything from national security updates to internal reports. His schedule was so packed that he hadn't even eaten lunch properly. As he started the car, he sighed, rubbing his eyes. He had chosen to drive himself for once. Normally, he had a driver and a small security team following close behind. But tonight he wanted a bit of peace and quiet, something rare for someone in his position. The highway was quiet, with only a few cars passing now and then. He turned on the radio, listening to a soft tune as the lights of the city slowly faded behind him. The road stretched ahead, lined with trees and street lamps glowing faintly in the cool night air. It was a peaceful drive, just the way he liked it. He thought about his family, his responsibilities, and how heavy the title of director could feel at times. Despite the pressure of his job, he often reminded himself to stay grounded, to remember that before the position, he was just a man trying to do his best. He had been driving for almost an hour when he noticed the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. At first he thought they were for someone else. He was sure he hadn't done anything wrong. But when the patrol car stayed behind him, signaling for him to pull over, he felt a small pang of confusion. He slowed down, moved to the side of the road, and stopped. For a moment he sat there, unsure of what had caused the stop. Maybe a broken taillight? Maybe a routine check? He reached for his identification wallet in the glove compartment. His official badge and ID were right there. As he prepared to step out, a beam of light hit his mirror. The officer's flashlight was already pointed at his car. The officer walked up quickly, the light flickering across the director's face. His tone was sharp from the start. "License and registration," the officer ordered. The director nodded calmly, keeping his hands visible. "Of course, officer," he said politely. He moved slowly, not wanting to startle the man, and handed over his driver's license. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Whose vehicle is this?" he asked. "This is a government vehicle," the director replied. "Issued to me for official use." But before he could say more, the officer interrupted. "Government vehicle, huh? You got proof of that?" The director hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to flash his FBI credentials unless absolutely necessary. It could draw too much attention. He decided to answer carefully. "Yes, I can show you my identification, sir," he said. He reached toward the glove box to retrieve it. "Don't move," the officer shouted suddenly, his voice echoing through the quiet night. The director froze. The tone, the volume, it was no longer a routine stop. "Step out of the vehicle right now!" the officer yelled, his hand moving toward his holster. The director took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. The cool night air brushed against his face. He stepped out carefully, keeping his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," he said gently. "If you allow me, I can explain. Hands where I can see them." The officer barked again, taking a step back while unholstering his gun. The sight of the weapon sent a chill through the director's spine. He stayed completely still, the headlights of the patrol car casting long shadows across the road. For a few seconds, time seemed to stop. The road was silent except for the hum of engines and the rustling of leaves nearby. The director could hear his own heartbeat. He tried to keep his voice calm. "Officer, I'm not resisting. Please just let me show you my identification. I'm a federal officer." But the words didn't seem to matter. The officer's expression remained hard, his voice firm. "You fit the description of a suspect driving a stolen SUV. Don't move." The director almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked around, realizing that no one else was there yet. No witnesses, no other patrol cars. If this went wrong, there would be no one to tell his side of the story. He thought about how ironic it was, the head of the FBI standing on the side of the road, being treated like a criminal. Still, he knew better than to argue. The key to surviving tense moments was patience and control, skills he had learned long ago. He tried to speak again, his voice steady. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but please listen carefully. My badge is inside the glove compartment. You can check it yourself. The officer hesitated, his finger resting near the trigger. His eyes darted toward the car, then back to the director. Stay right there, he muttered. He circled around the vehicle, flashlight in hand, glancing through the window. The director remained still, his hands slightly raised, trying to stay calm despite the humiliation he felt. A car passed by slowly on the other side of the road. The driver looked for a moment, curious about the scene, but kept going. The director wished someone had stopped. Just one witness could change everything. The officer finally came back around to the front, his face still tight with suspicion. What did you say your name was? He demanded. The director repeated his name, firm and clear this time. I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said. The officer blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Yeah, right, he muttered, shaking his head. Everyone's somebody important when they get pulled over. The director almost smiled at the absurdity, but the situation was far too serious. I'm not joking, officer. I have credentials inside. If you allow me, you can verify them right now. Not another word, the officer snapped, raising the gun slightly again. Hands up higher! The director complied, feeling a wave of frustration he hadn't felt in years. For someone who spent his life promoting justice and integrity, standing here with a gun pointed at him by someone wearing the same badge of law enforcement felt almost unreal. A few minutes passed before another patrol car arrived. The second officer stepped out, immediately noticing the strange scene. A man in business clothes standing calmly with his hands up, and another officer holding him at gunpoint. The newcomer approached cautiously. What's going on here? He asked. Suspect's driving a stolen vehicle, the first officer replied quickly. He's refusing to comply. The second officer frowned and looked at the director. Something about the man's calmness seemed unusual. Most suspects would be panicking or shouting by now. Sir, do you have any ID on you? He asked politely. Yes, the director said softly. Inside the glove box. My badge and credentials are there. Please check them. The second officer nodded slowly and walked toward the SUV. The first officer warned, Be careful, but the second ignored him. He opened the passenger door and took out a black leather wallet from the compartment. Inside was a shiny badge and a federal ID card. The moment his eyes read the name, his jaw dropped. He turned back toward his colleague, voice trembling slightly. You need to lower your weapon, he said firmly. What? Why? The first officer demanded, still aiming his gun. Because, the second officer said, holding up the badge so the light reflected off it. This man is the director of the FBI. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything. The officer froze, lowering the gun slowly, his face pale. That's impossible, he whispered. The director finally lowered his hands, taking a deep breath. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. It's quite possible, he said quietly. And I'd like to go home now. The first officer stammered, trying to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out. The second officer looked mortified, realizing how serious this mistake could become. The director didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even demand names. He simply said, You'll be hearing from your department soon, and stepped back into his vehicle. As he closed the door, the flashing lights still reflected off the windows. He started the engine, leaving the stunned officers behind. As he drove away, the tension slowly faded, but the thought remained heavy in his mind. How could something like that happen to anyone, let alone to someone who had dedicated his life to justice? He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The incident wasn't over. The truth would soon come out, and the world would see what really happened that night. The drive back to the city was quiet, but inside the car, the director's thoughts were loud and restless. The flashing lights from the patrol car were long behind him now, yet the scene kept replaying in his mind. The officer's voice, the gun pointed at him, the disbelief on the second officer's face, and it all felt like something out of a movie. Except it wasn't. It had happened to him, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the country. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He had faced dangerous moments before, during investigations, high-stakes missions, even tense briefings in Washington. But this one was different. This wasn't a criminal or a terrorist. This was a police officer, someone meant to protect and serve. And yet, that same man had almost made a decision that could have ended very differently. When he reached his home, the neighborhood was silent. The streetlights glowed softly and the only sound was the faint hum of insects. He parked the car, sat still for a few moments, and then leaned back in his seat. He didn't feel angry. He felt something deeper and disappointment. He knew the country's justice system wasn't perfect. He had spent his career trying to make it better. But tonight had shown him how fragile it really was. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come in pieces. His phone was already full of messages and missed calls. It seemed that someone, perhaps a passerby, had filmed part of the encounter. The video was making rounds online. Not yet viral, but spreading fast. He didn't need to watch it. He had lived it. When he arrived at the bureau headquarters, the atmosphere was different. People greeted him with respect as always, but there was something else in their eyes. A mix of concern and curiosity. One of his senior assistants met him in the hallway and said quietly, "Sir, we've seen the video. It's already being shared by several news outlets." He nodded. "I expected that," he said calmly. "Call a meeting with the communications team. I want this handled properly. No statements yet." Inside his office, the morning light streamed through the large windows. He took off his coat and sat down behind his desk. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the small American flag on the corner. It reminded him of the oath he took years ago, to protect the Constitution, to uphold justice, and to set an example. He wondered what message this incident would send to the thousands of officers who looked up to him. Across town, the police department involved in the traffic stop was in chaos. The chief of police had already been alerted. He was furious, not just because of what happened, but because of who it happened to. The moment he saw the video and confirmed the details, he called an emergency meeting. The officer involved sat quietly at the end of the table, his face pale, his hands fidgeting. The chief slammed a folder on the table. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. The officer swallowed hard but didn't speak. "You pointed your weapon at the director of the FBI," the chief continued, his voice rising. "Without checking the license plate properly, without verifying identification. What were you thinking?" The officer tried to explain. He said the car matched the description of a stolen vehicle, that he was just following procedure. But even as he spoke, the excuses sounded weak. The chief interrupted him. "Procedure doesn't mean drawing a gun on someone who's cooperating," he said sharply. "You broke every rule in the book." By noon, the story had reached every major news network. Headlines were everywhere. "Police officer points gun at FBI director during traffic stop." Some channels were careful with their wording, while others were already calling it a scandal. The video clip played again and again. The flashing lights, the officer shouting, and the calm, steady voice of the director trying to explain. Inside the bureau, phones rang nonstop. Reporters wanted comments. Government officials wanted updates. Even members of Congress were asking questions. But the director stayed composed. He gathered his team and spoke firmly. "We will not turn this into a political fight," he said. "We'll let the investigation do its work. But we will not stay silent about accountability." Meanwhile, the officer who had drawn his gun felt the weight of his actions more with each passing hour. He couldn't escape the attention. Colleagues avoided eye contact. News vans parked outside his house. His family received calls they didn't know how to answer. He hadn't meant to threaten anyone, at least that's what he told himself. But deep down he knew he had gone too far. At the same time, people across the country had mixed reactions. Some were shocked that such a thing could happen. Others weren't surprised at all, saying it showed the problems in law enforcement. The rush to judgment, the lack of patience, the failure to see the person instead of the suspect. Social media was filled with comments, arguments, and debates. Through all of it, the director stayed silent publicly. But behind the scenes, he began working. He contacted the Justice Department, informing them of the event officially. An internal review was launched immediately. He didn't want revenge. He wanted truth. 2 days later, he received a call from the city's mayor, offering a personal apology. The mayor sounded nervous, his words careful. "Director, we're deeply sorry for what happened. The officer has been suspended while we investigate." "I appreciate that," the director replied, "but let's make sure this isn't about me. Let's make sure it's about fixing what's broken." The mayor promised cooperation. Still, the director knew that promises were easy to make and hard to keep. He had seen too many cases where accountability faded once the headlines moved on. As the investigation started, The footage was analyzed, frame by frame. The body cam recording showed that the officer had escalated the situation almost immediately. There was no threat, no aggressive move from the director. It was a clear case of poor judgment. The review board took note of every word, every gesture. Back at the bureau, his staff encouraged him to issue a statement. "People want to hear from you," one of them said. "They want to know how you feel." He thought for a moment and then said, "If I speak, it won't be to express anger. It'll be to remind people that leadership means patience, even in moments of injustice." He finally addressed the public 3 days later. Standing before a group of reporters, he looked calm but serious. Cameras flashed as he spoke. "What happened to me was unfortunate," he said. "But this isn't about titles or ranks. This is about the importance of discipline and respect, values that must guide every officer who wears a badge. No one is above the law, but no one should ever be treated unfairly either. This is not about punishment. It's about learning and accountability." His words struck a chord across the country. News anchors replayed his statement. People admired how he handled the situation, with dignity and restraint. It wasn't about pride or power. It was about principle. At the local police department, the chief watched the statement on television. He turned to his officers and said quietly, "That's leadership." Everyone in the room knew what he meant. In the days that followed, investigators interviewed witnesses, reviewed training protocols, and spoke to other officers who had worked with the man responsible for the stop. Some described him as overzealous, quick to assume the worst. Others said he was just inexperienced and afraid of making mistakes. But the truth was simple: he had acted recklessly, and that choice had consequences. The director continued his duties as usual, though his mind often drifted back to that night. He couldn't forget the fear in the officer's eyes, not the fear of danger, but the fear of being challenged. It reminded him that authority can easily turn into arrogance if not guided by conscience. One evening, as he left the office again, he stood for a moment outside, looking at the city lights. The same road he had taken days ago stretched out in the distance. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently. A few more seconds, one wrong move, and the story could have ended in tragedy. He whispered to himself, "Things have to change," and deep down, he knew that this incident, however painful, might just become the beginning of that change. Because sometimes it takes one shocking mistake to open everyone's eyes to the truth, that respect, patience, and humility are not signs of weakness in law enforcement. They're signs of strength. The investigation wasn't over yet. The court would have its say, the officer would face judgment, and the public would watch closely. But one thing was certain. The director had turned a personal ordeal into a lesson the entire country could learn from. And this was only the beginning. The investigation was now in full swing. Each day brought new details, new evidence, and more questions about how such a serious mistake could have happened. The director had chosen not to involve himself directly in the inquiry, but he was being updated regularly. He didn't want to influence the process. He wanted the truth to come out naturally through the right channels. Inside the local police department, the mood had completely changed. What used to be a place full of chatter and casual greetings had turned tense and quiet. Officers spoke in hushed voices. Some were angry, others confused, but most were simply worried about what this would mean for the department's future. The officer who had pointed the gun at the director was now suspended. He spent most of his days at home, avoiding calls and messages. The media had already published his name. Reporters camped outside his house, waiting for a comment he never gave. He felt trapped between guilt and fear. In his mind, he replayed the moment again and again. The flashing lights, the calm voice of the man he had stopped, the disbelief when he saw the FBI badge. It haunted him every night. Meanwhile, at the bureau, the director went about his duties as usual. Outwardly, he appeared calm and collected, but those close to him could see that the incident had affected him deeply. He still treated everyone with respect, still spoke with the same gentle authority, but there was a quiet seriousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, during a meeting with his senior team, one of them said carefully, "Sir, the local department's internal affairs has found serious violations in the officer's conduct. It seems he failed to follow at least 4 standard procedures during the stop." The director leaned back in his chair, listening intently. "Go on," he said. He didn't verify the license plate before pulling you over, the agent continued. He also failed to call for backup before drawing his weapon, and he ignored the identification you offered. On top of that, his report of the event doesn't match the body cam footage. There was a pause in the room. Everyone knew what that meant. The director nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Let's make sure the findings are sent to the Justice Department. No one should interfere." After the meeting, he stood by the window in his office, looking out at the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought about the young officer again. It was clear that the man had acted out of fear, not malice, but fear could still ruin lives. He wondered how many other officers across the country made decisions like that every day, simply because they lacked proper training or control. He didn't want this case to become just another headline. He wanted it to mean something. That evening, he received a call from the police chief of the same department. The chief's voice sounded heavy. "Director, I wanted to update you personally," he said. "The investigation has found clear misconduct. We've submitted our report to the district attorney." "I appreciate that," the director replied. "How's your department handling all this?" The chief sighed. "It's been rough. The morale is low. Some officers feel embarrassed. Others are angry that this is what's defining our image now. But I told them this is how we rebuild trust, by owning our mistakes." "That's the right approach," the director said softly. "I've always believed that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about facing the truth when you're not." There was a short silence on the line before the chief spoke again. "The officer wants to apologize to you personally," he said. "I know it's awkward, but he asked for the chance." The director thought for a moment. "Not now," he said gently. "There's a process for everything. Let's allow the law to finish its course first." The next few weeks passed quickly. The media continued to cover the story, though the tone had changed. Many journalists now praised how the director had handled the situation, with grace and composure. Editorials called it an example of leadership under pressure. People admired how he had refused to attack the officer publicly, even when he easily could have. But behind all the public praise, the director remained focused on the bigger picture. He ordered a review within the FBI as well, an assessment of how federal and local agencies coordinated with each other. He wanted to identify where communication and training could improve. If this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. At the same time, the officer's life had fallen apart. He spent his days reading news articles, watching the same footage that had ruined his reputation. He barely spoke to anyone, even his friends. He had always dreamed of being a respected officer, of helping people, of wearing the badge with pride. But one bad moment, one terrible decision had changed everything. His family tried to comfort him, but he could see the disappointment in their faces too. His father, a retired officer, had visited him one evening. The old man sat quietly at the kitchen table, then said in a low voice, "You forgot what that badge means. It's not power. It's responsibility." Those words stayed with him for days. Finally, the official charges came. The district attorney announced that the officer would face charges for misconduct and unlawful use of force. It was a serious matter. The press gathered outside the courthouse the morning of his hearing. Cameras flashed as he walked inside, his head down, surrounded by lawyers. The director didn't attend the hearing, but he followed it closely through updates. He had no intention of influencing the outcome, but he wanted justice to be fair. Not cruel, not exaggerated, just fair. He also made sure the FBI didn't comment publicly about the trial. It wasn't their role to judge. The court would handle that. During the hearing, the officer stood before the judge, his voice shaking as he spoke. He said he had made a mistake, that he hadn't recognized who he was dealing with, that fear had clouded his judgment. He said he never meant to harm anyone and that he wished he could take it all back. The courtroom was silent. Even those who disliked him could see the sincerity in his face. But sincerity couldn't undo the consequences. The law had to take its course. Outside, reporters surrounded the courthouse steps. Some asked whether the officer's punishment would be harsher because the victim was a high-ranking official. Others questioned whether it should be lighter since no harm was done. The debate spread across the nation. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. But for the director, it wasn't about punishment or politics. It was about accountability. He believed in second chances, but he also believed that actions must have consequences. If he, The head of a federal agency could be stopped and treated unfairly. What did that say about ordinary citizens who face similar situations every day? That thought troubled him the most. Weeks later, the court proceedings were still ongoing, but the public had already formed its view. The officer had become a symbol of everything that needed to change in law enforcement. And the director, unwillingly, had become the face of that conversation. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he used it wisely. He began speaking at training programs and law enforcement gatherings, not about his personal experience, but about lessons learned. He emphasized communication, restraint, and respect. An officer's strength, he said during one speech, isn't measured by how fast he reaches for his weapon. It's measured by how calmly he can control a tense situation without ever needing to. His words resonated deeply. Many departments began revising their training programs. It was a small but meaningful ripple of change, one that might not have happened without that terrible night. The officer's trial was nearing its end, and the outcome was clear. The evidence, the footage, and the investigation all pointed in one direction. The director knew what was coming, but he didn't celebrate it. There was nothing to celebrate in another man's downfall, even if it came from his own mistakes. He often thought about calling the officer after everything was over, not to scold, but to speak as one human being to another. Maybe he would someday, but not yet. The wounds were still fresh and the world was still watching. As he left his office late one evening, the halls were quiet again. The building lights dimmed and he paused at the door, thinking of everything that had happened. The night it all began, the fear, the silence, the reflection in the officer's eyes, he remembered it all. He walked to his car slowly, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel. The same black SUV that had caused all the trouble was now just a car again. But to him, it would always be a reminder of how quickly authority can become danger, and how important it is to keep humility at the heart of power. He started the engine, looked at his reflection in the mirror, and whispered softly to himself, "This isn't the end. It's the start of something better." And deep down he believed it. The quiet night air outside the police station felt heavy. The FBI director, still shaken from the traffic stop, sat inside an unmarked government car parked by the station's entrance. The flashing red and blue lights had faded into the distance, but their memory lingered like an echo in his chest. He was a man who had spent his whole career dealing with high-level operations, secret investigations, and national security briefings, yet nothing had felt as personal, as unexpected as what had just happened on that roadside. Inside the station, the young officer who had pulled him over sat on a metal bench, hands trembling slightly. His badge had been taken from him for the moment. Two senior officers spoke in low tones across the hallway, avoiding eye contact with him. The silence was thick with tension. No one had expected the man behind the wheel of that black SUV to be the director of the FBI. The officer himself had been so certain he was dealing with someone suspicious that he hadn't stopped to question his own assumptions. Now those assumptions had landed him in the middle of the biggest internal review their department had ever seen. The police chief entered the room quietly, his face calm, but eyes sharp. He walked straight to the officer and sat across from him. "You know who that was, don't you?" the chief asked in a low, steady tone. The young man swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I didn't know it at the time." The chief nodded slowly. "You pulled over the director of the FBI. You drew your weapon on him." The officer looked down at his hands. "Sir, I thought—" "That's the problem," the chief interrupted softly. "You thought wrong." The words hit harder than any shout. Meanwhile, the FBI director sat silently, replaying the moment in his mind. The flashing lights in the rearview mirror, the voice yelling commands, the barrel of a gun pointed at him even as he calmly tried to identify himself. He had seen dangerous situations before, but this one had carried a kind of irony that was hard to ignore. He wasn't angry, at least not in the usual way. What he felt was disappointment. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about how easily trust and communication could collapse in seconds, even between people who were supposed to be on the same side of the law. An assistant approached the car window and spoke softly. "Sir, the chief is ready to see you." He nodded and stepped out, straightening his jacket before walking into the building. The moment he entered, every conversation in the hallway stopped. Officers turned their heads, some whispering, some looking down. It wasn't often that the nation's top law enforcement official walked into a local station, especially under circumstances like these. The police chief met him with a firm handshake. "Director, I'm deeply sorry for what happened tonight. It shouldn't have occurred." "I understand mistakes happen," the director said calmly, "but this was more than a mistake. Your officer aimed a gun at a federal official without verification. That's a serious breach," the chief nodded. "It will be handled properly, I assure you." The director studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I'm not here for revenge or embarrassment, but there must be accountability. And more importantly, there must be learning. You can't build trust between departments if fear and impulse control every decision." The chief sighed. "You're right. We've got training programs, but maybe they're not enough." "They're not," the director said plainly. "I've seen this pattern before. Hesitation replaced by aggression. It doesn't help anyone." Across the hallway, the young officer could hear the voices faintly through the wall. His stomach felt twisted. Every word reminded him of how far one moment of misjudgment could go. He thought about the flashing lights, his own heartbeat pounding as he approached the car window. He remembered the calm voice of the man behind the wheel, introducing himself and warning that he was a federal officer. But he hadn't listened. He'd been too focused on his own fear of danger to hear the words properly. When the meeting ended, the director walked out of the chief's office. As he passed the holding room, he paused for a brief moment. Through the small window, he could see the young officer sitting quietly, staring at the floor. Their eyes met for a second. The director didn't speak, but his look carried more weight than any lecture could. Outside, he got into his car, took a deep breath, and told his driver to head home. The following morning, news of the incident began to spread. It wasn't leaked by the FBI or the police. Someone from the scene had recorded the interaction from across the street. The short clip showed the officer shouting commands and the driver calmly raising his hands. The sound wasn't clear, but the tension was obvious. Social media picked it up quickly. People speculated about who the driver was until someone recognized the FBI-issued vehicle. Within hours, reporters were gathering outside the local police department, asking questions the officers weren't ready to answer. At FBI headquarters, the director's assistant placed a stack of newspapers on his desk. Every headline focused on the same thing: a local officer pulling a gun on the nation's top investigator. The director stared at the papers for a while before pushing them aside. He didn't want the story to become about embarrassment or power. He wanted it to become a conversation about professionalism, communication, and reform. But he knew how unpredictable public attention could be. Later that day, he received a call from the state governor, expressing deep regret over what had happened and promising that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. The director thanked him but kept his tone neutral. He didn't want politics mixing into what should be a matter of accountability and improvement. By afternoon, the police department held a press conference. The chief stood before a row of microphones and addressed the situation with calm seriousness. "We take full responsibility for the actions that took place last night," he said. "The incident is under internal review, and the officer involved has been temporarily suspended pending investigation. Our department has reached out to federal authorities and expressed our apology to the director and his team." Reporters shouted questions, but the chief declined to answer details. Meanwhile, inside his office, the young officer watched the press conference live on a small television. Each word from the chief felt like another stone added to the weight already on his chest. He knew he had made a mistake, but he also knew there was no undoing it. All he could do was accept whatever consequences were coming. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, the FBI director sat by his window with a cup of coffee, reflecting quietly. His phone buzzed with messages of support and outrage from colleagues, but he ignored most of them. He wasn't interested in blame, he wanted change. He began drafting a memo, outlining new collaborative training programs between federal and local officers, programs focused on communication, restraint, and recognizing authority verification. He wanted to use this moment to build something better, something that could prevent future misunderstandings. But as he wrote, another call came in, this time from the Department of Justice. They wanted a formal statement. The situation had escalated quickly, and the officer's behavior was being reviewed under federal misconduct guidelines. The director paused, staring out the window for a long time before replying. "I'll cooperate fully," he said, "but make sure the purpose stays clear. This isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility." By the next morning, the entire city was talking about it. News anchors debated professionalism in policing, experts discussed accountability, and community members voiced their views online. The officer's name wasn't released yet, but rumors spread fast. Inside the police department, pressure grew. Calls poured in from media outlets, local leaders, and even national figures. The chief knew that something decisive had to be done soon, or the public trust in their department would suffer deeply. That night, the officer was officially detained for further questioning, not out of malice, but as part of a transparent process to show the department's commitment to justice. The moment he was escorted from the building, cameras outside flashed wildly. The story had reached a point of no return, yet amid all the noise, the FBI director remained calm. He didn't want anyone destroyed, only reminded of the weight of their duty. He knew that what happened next would define not just one man's future, but how both agencies moved forward together. And as he closed his office that night, he couldn't help but think, sometimes it takes a painful mistake to bring real change to light. The next morning arrived quietly, but the air in the police department was thick with unease. Everyone had heard what happened. The incident wasn't just a local story anymore. It had gone national. News vans crowded outside and reporters stood near the entrance, speaking into cameras with serious expressions. Inside, phones rang nonstop. Officers tried to focus on their regular work, but whispers followed through the halls. The young officer who had pulled his weapon sat in an interview room again. This time he wasn't wearing his uniform. His badge and gun had already been taken away. Across the table sat two investigators from the Internal Affairs Unit. They weren't unkind, but their questions were firm and steady. "When you pulled the car over, what made you think it was a threat?" one of them asked. The officer hesitated before answering. It was late, and the car was a black SUV with tinted windows. "I thought the driver was avoiding eye contact." I asked for identification, and he reached toward his jacket. "I thought he was reaching for something else." "Did he tell you who he was?" "Yes," the officer said softly. "He said he was a federal officer." But in that moment, I didn't believe him. "Why not?" The officer stared down at his hands. "I've stopped people who lied before." "I thought he was one of them." The investigator nodded slowly. "So you made a decision based on fear, not fact." The word stung, but he didn't argue. It was true. Across town at the FBI headquarters, the director sat in his office reading through a report about the incident. His staff had collected every detail, the dashcam footage, witness statements, and the body camera video from the officer. He'd watched it once already. The images played in his mind even without the screen. It wasn't anger that drove him now. It was purpose. He had decided that this moment had to become something larger than embarrassment or punishment. It had to become a lesson. He called his deputy into the room. "I want a full meeting with the police chief and his training division," he said. "We're going to talk about how we move forward from this on together." The deputy nodded. "Sir, the press is asking if you plan to press charges." The director leaned back in his chair. "This isn't about revenge. It's about rebuilding trust." Later that day, the director and the police chief met again in a quiet conference room away from the media. The atmosphere was calm but serious. Both men understood the weight of the moment. The director began. "Your officer made a mistake, a serious one. But we both know mistakes like this come from deeper issues. Miscommunication, fear, training gaps. We need to fix those." The chief nodded. "I agree. I've been in this job long enough to know when we need to change course. I've already requested an external review of our training procedures." "That's good," the director said, "but it can't just be a report that gets filed away. Let's build something real, a program where federal and local officers train together. They need to understand each other, not just by title but by perspective." The chief thought for a moment, then said, "If we do that, we'll need both departments to commit fully. No finger-pointing, no pride, just honest cooperation." The director gave a small smile. "That's exactly what I'm asking for." As they spoke, the young officer remained in custody for review. The department had to show accountability, and though he hadn't harmed anyone, the decision to draw his weapon without proper cause couldn't be overlooked. That night, the story dominated the evening news. Commentators debated the meaning behind the incident. Some called it a tragic misunderstanding. Others said it was proof that training and trust between agencies needed improvement. The footage of the traffic stop had been viewed millions of times online. Everyone had an opinion. In his small apartment, the officer watched the coverage alone. The sound of his own name made his stomach tighten. He had never wanted fame, certainly not like this. He thought about how different things could have gone if he had just paused for 1 second longer, if he had listened more carefully, if he had trusted his training instead of his fear. A knock came at his door. It was the police chief. The officer looked surprised. "Sir?" The chief stepped inside quietly. "You're under review, yes, but I didn't come to lecture you. I came to talk." The officer looked down. "I know I've ruined everything." The chief shook his head. "You made a mistake. One that carries consequences, but it doesn't have to define you. The director isn't pressing charges. He wants this to be a lesson for all of us." The officer frowned. "He's not pressing charges." "No," the chief said. "He believes this moment should be used to teach, not destroy. You'll still have to face the internal board, but he's not trying to end your life or career. He's trying to fix what led to this." The officer sat silently for a moment, emotion welling in his chest. "I don't deserve that kind of mercy," the chief sighed. "Maybe not. But that's what leadership looks like. Learn from it." The next day, the director held a private meeting with several law enforcement agencies from around the state. It was closed to the public, but the discussion was honest and raw. They talked about the gaps between local and federal operations, how suspicion sometimes replaced respect, how communication was often lost in ego or assumption. The director listened to every voice in the room. Then he said, "I've been in this field long enough to know that fear can undo years of training in a single second. But we can't keep pretending this is just about bad luck. It's about preparation, understanding, and respect. That has to be taught and practiced." Everyone in the room nodded. They knew he was right. Later that evening, the chief called the director again. "We've decided to move forward with a joint training program," he said. "Your office will lead the structure and will assign officers to participate in the first round." "That's the right call," the director said with a calm tone. "Let's make sure this never happens again." Meanwhile, public opinion began to shift. At first, people had demanded punishment, but as more details came out, including the director's calm response and his decision not to seek personal retaliation, the narrative changed. Many began praising his leadership, calling it an example of professionalism and restraint. The following week, the officer faced the internal review board. The hearing was quiet but serious. He admitted to his mistake without excuses. When asked what he had learned, he said simply, "That fear can't guide my judgment. I should have listened. I should have trusted the process." The board appreciated his honesty. Their final decision was firm but fair. The officer would be suspended without pay for several months and required to complete advanced training before he could return. When the news reached the FBI director, he nodded quietly. "That's the right outcome," he told his deputy. Accountability with the chance to grow. That's what justice should look like. The days that followed were calmer. The noise in the media began to fade. Other stories took over the headlines, but inside law enforcement circles, the incident continued to echo. It became part of the training curriculum in multiple states, a real-life case study about communication, judgment, and restraint. For the officer, those months of suspension became a period of reflection. He attended workshops, listened to speakers who had faced similar situations, and met with federal agents who shared their experiences from the other side. Slowly, his understanding deepened. He realized that his mistake wasn't just about a single decision. It was about the mindset that led to it. A mindset shaped by assumptions, fear, and years of hearing worst-case stories instead of learning real collaboration. When he finally completed his training and returned to the department, he wasn't the same man. He was quieter, humbler, and far more aware of the weight of his badge. The first person he visited after returning was the police chief. The chief looked up from his desk and gave a small smile. "You're back." "Yes, sir," the officer said. "And I'm ready to do things differently." The chief nodded. "That's good. Because next month you'll be part of a new joint program with the FBI. I think you'll find it meaningful." The officer looked surprised. "You mean, after everything?" "Especially after everything," the chief said. "You've lived it. That gives you something valuable to teach." That night, the officer drove home under the soft glow of city lights. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He couldn't erase what had happened, but he could make sure it never repeated. Not for him, not for anyone else, and somewhere across town. The FBI director sat in his office, reading the final report on the case. It ended with one line that stayed with him. "Change begins when mistakes are met with responsibility, not rage." He smiled faintly, closed the file, and whispered to himself, "Exactly right." Months passed, and the noise that once surrounded the incident had quieted. The headlines had disappeared, the cameras were gone, and life inside the police department had begun to return to normal. But for the people directly involved, the memory of that night had left a mark that would never completely fade. The young officer had returned to duty, but everything about him had changed, not in a visible, dramatic way, but in small, meaningful ways that others noticed. He listened more carefully. He spoke with more patience. When he pulled someone over, his tone was calm, not commanding. His fellow officers saw it and felt it. He wasn't the same man who had acted out of fear that night. He was someone who had learned, deeply and painfully, what responsibility meant. One morning, he arrived at the police academy where a new joint training program between the FBI and local law enforcement was being launched. The idea had come directly from the FBI director himself, and now, for the first time, officers and agents were training side by side, learning about communication, de-escalation, and trust. The officer stood quietly at the back of the room as the session began. The director walked to the front, dressed in a simple dark suit, carrying no notes. The room fell silent. "I'm not here to talk about rank or titles," the director began. "I'm here to talk about trust, the kind of trust that keeps both officers and citizens safe." His voice was calm but firm. He looked around the room, his gaze steady. "A few months ago, I was pulled over during a late-night drive. The officer who stopped me made a mistake. But I'm not here to shame him. I'm here because that mistake reminded me of something all of us forget. That fear and judgment can cloud even the best training. And when they do, the cost can be heavy." The room was quiet. The director continued, "We can't erase what happens when things go wrong. But we can learn from it. We can build something stronger from it." He then turned slightly toward the back of the room. "The officer who stopped me that night is here today. He agreed to join this program, not because he was forced to, but because he wants to make sure no one else repeats his mistake." All heads turned as the officer slowly stood. His heart pounded in his chest, but he took a step forward. He didn't look at the ground this time. He looked straight ahead, his voice steady though soft. "I made a decision that night that could have gone very wrong," he said. "It was a decision made out of fear, not judgment. I thought I was protecting myself. But I forgot that real protection comes from understanding, not from reaction." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Since that day, I've learned more than I did in all my years on the force. I learned that it's okay to pause before reacting, to ask instead of assume, and most of all, I learned that respect isn't something you demand with a badge. It's something you earn through your actions." The room stayed silent, but the faces of those listening had softened. It wasn't a lecture, it was a confession. A human moment that everyone in that room could relate to in one way or another. After the session, several officers approached him quietly, shaking his hand, thanking him for speaking. They didn't see him as a failure anymore. They saw him as someone who had faced his mistakes and chosen growth instead of denial. Outside, the director stood watching through the glass wall, a faint smile on his face. For the first time since that night, he felt a genuine sense of peace. Something good had finally come out of something painful. Over the next few months, the joint training program grew quickly. It spread to other states, with the director personally overseeing its structure. News outlets covered it again, but this time with positive headlines, calling it a model of collaboration between law enforcement agencies. The officer became one of the key speakers in those sessions. He wasn't polished or rehearsed, but that made his words real. He spoke from experience, not from notes. Every time he told his story, he reminded new officers that their decisions carried weight far beyond the moment. One day, After another long session, he walked out into the parking lot and found the FBI director standing near his car. The man smiled and said, "You're doing good work." The officer shook his head. "You're the one who gave me the chance. You could have destroyed me after what happened." "You didn't." The director smiled faintly. "I could have. But that wouldn't have fixed anything. You learned from it, and now you're helping others learn too. That's worth more than punishment." There was a quiet moment between them. The city buzzed softly in the background like cars passing, distant voices, the hum of life continuing as usual. The officer finally said, "That night, I thought it was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But now I think it might have been the lesson I needed." The director nodded. "Life has a strange way of teaching us things, sometimes through pain, sometimes through reflection. What matters is what we do afterward." They shook hands, not as victim and offender, not as superior and subordinate, but as two men who had both faced the uncomfortable truth about fear and responsibility. As weeks passed, the training program continued to thrive. Officers and agents from different parts of the country came together, not to point fingers but to learn from one another. They practiced scenarios, discussed real cases, and shared honest conversations about pressure, decision-making, and respect. The officer found new purpose in it. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was shaping how others would handle their jobs. Every time he saw a young recruit nod thoughtfully during a session, he felt a quiet pride. Meanwhile, the FBI director continued his mission to modernize law enforcement culture. In interviews, he often spoke about accountability and growth. He never mentioned the officer's name publicly, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he believed the story wasn't about blame. It was about what people could do after they realized their flaws. Months later, during an award ceremony for public service innovation, the director stood on stage before hundreds of people. The training program was being recognized as one of the most successful law enforcement reforms of the year. When he was invited to say a few words, he paused for a moment before speaking. "This program wasn't born from pride or success," he said. "It was born from a mistake, and a painful one. But it taught us something important, that progress begins when we stop protecting our egos and start protecting our humanity." In the audience, the officer sat quietly, listening. The words hit deep. He never thought he would be sitting in a room like this, not after everything that had happened. After the ceremony ended, the director found him again. "You know," he said, smiling gently, "this might never have happened if not for that night." The officer nodded. "I've thought about that too. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that end up changing everything." The director looked thoughtful for a moment. Maybe that's what growth really is, learning to turn a mistake into a reason to do better. They both stood in silence for a while, surrounded by applause and bright lights, but their thoughts were elsewhere. On the quiet road where it all began, under the flashing red and blue lights that had once divided them but now connected them in a strange, unplanned way. That night, the officer drove home, the city lights glowing faintly through his windshield. He passed by the same stretch of road where everything had happened months ago. The same trees, the same streetlights, the same faded white lines on the asphalt. He slowed down for a moment and took a deep breath. The road looked different now, not like a place of fear or regret, but like a reminder of how far he'd come. He smiled softly to himself and whispered, "Thank you for the lesson." Then he drove on. In another part of the city, the FBI director sat in his office watching the sun go down. The light through the window painted the room gold. He thought about how strange life could be, how one tense night on a dark road had turned into a story of understanding, redemption, and change. He picked up his pen and wrote a short note in his journal. Every mistake carries a message. Every person carries a chance to change. And every moment, and no matter how hard, one can lead to something better if we listen and learn. He set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes for a moment of quiet reflection. Outside, the world kept moving. The lessons learned from that one night continued to ripple outward, through officers, agents, and ordinary people who heard the story and realized that humanity, not authority, is what truly keeps people safe. And in the end, that was what both men, the director and the officer, had finally understood. That respect, patience, and understanding could do more for justice than fear or power ever could. The night that once represented failure had become a symbol of growth. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of ending there is.